Revolution and Counter-Revolution, or Germany in 1848, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Chapter 17, Insurrection, September 18th, 1852. The inevitable conflict between the National Assembly of Frankfurt and the states governments of Germany at last broke out in open hostilities during the first days of May, 1849. The Austrian deputies, recalled by their government, had already left the assembly and returned home, with the exception of a few members of the Left or Democratic Party. The great body of the conservative members, aware of the turn things were about to take, withdrew even before they were called upon to do so by their respective governments. Thus, even independently of the causes which in the foregoing letters have been shown to strengthen the influence of the left, the mere desertion of their posts by the members of the right sufficed to turn the old minority into a majority of the assembly. The new majority, which at no former time had dreamed of ever obtaining that good fortune, had profited by their places on the opposition benches to spout against the weakness, the indecision, the indolence of the old majority and of its imperial lieutenancy. Now all at once they were called on to replace that old majority. They were now to show what they could perform. Of course, their career was to be one of energy, determination, activity. They, the elite of Germany, would soon be able to drive onwards the senile lieutenant of the empire and his vacillating ministers, and in case that was impossible they would, there could be no doubt about it, by force of the sovereign right of the people, depose that impotent government and replace it by an energetic, indefatigable executive who would assure the salvation of Germany. Poor fellows! Their rule, if rule it can be named, where no one obeyed, was still a more ridiculous affair than even the rule of their predecessors. The new majority declared that, in spite of all obstacles, the imperial constitution must be carried out, and at once. That on the 15th of July ensuing, the people were to elect the deputies of the new House of Representatives, and that this House was to meet at Frankfurt on the 15th of August following. Now, this was an open declaration of war against those governments that had not recognized the imperial constitution, the foremost among which were Prussia, Austria, Bavaria, composing more than 3/4 of the German population, a declaration of war which was speedily accepted by them. Prussia and Bavaria, too, recalled the deputies sent from their territories to Frankfurt, and hastened their military preparations against the National Assembly, while on the other hand, the demonstrations of the Democratic Party, out of Parliament, in favor of the imperial constitution and of the National Assembly, acquired a more turbulent and violent character, and the mass of the working people, led by the men of the most extreme party, were ready to take up arms in a cause which, if it was not their own, at least gave them a chance of somewhat approaching their aims by clearing Germany of its old monarchical encumbrances. Thus everywhere the people and the governments were at daggers drawn upon this subject. The outbreak was inevitable, the mine was charged, and it only wanted a spark to make it explode. The dissolution of the chambers in Saxony, the calling in of the Landwehr military reserve in Prussia, the open resistance of the government to the imperial constitution were such sparks. They fell, and all at once the country was in a blaze. In Dresden, on the 4th of May, the people victoriously took possession of the town and drove out the king, while all the surrounding districts sent reinforcements to the insurgents. In Rhenish Prussia and Westphalia the Landwehr refused to march, took possession of the arsenals, and armed itself in defense of the imperial constitution. In the Palatinate, the people seized the Bavarian government officials and the public moneys, and instituted a committee of defense, which placed the province under the protection of the National Assembly. In Württemberg, the people forced the king to acknowledge the imperial constitution, and in Baden the army, united with the people, forced the Grand Duke to flight and directed a provincial government. In other parts of Germany, the people only awaited a decisive signal from the National Assembly to rise in arms and place themselves at its disposal. The position of the National Assembly was far more favorable than could have been expected after its ignoble career. The western half of Germany had taken up arms in its behalf. The military everywhere were vacillating. In the lesser states they were undoubtedly favorable to the movement. Austria was prostrated by the victorious advance of the Hungarians, and Russia, that reserved force of the German governments, was straining all its powers in order to support Austria against the Magyar armies. There was only Prussia to subdue, and with the revolutionary sympathies existing in that country, a chance certainly existed of attaining that end. Everything then depended upon the conduct of the Assembly. Now, insurrection is an art quite as much as war or any other, and subject to certain rules of proceeding, which, when neglected, will produce the ruin of the party neglecting them. These rules, logical deductions from the nature of the parties and the circumstances one has to deal with in such a case, are so plain and simple that the short experience of 1848 had made the Germans pretty well acquainted with them. Firstly, never play with insurrection unless you are fully prepared to face the consequences of your play. Insurrection is a calculus with very indefinite magnitudes, the value of which may change every day. The forces opposed to you have all the advantage of organization, discipline, and habitual authority. Unless you bring strong odds against them, you are defeated and ruined. Secondly, the insurrectionary career once entered upon, act with the greatest determination, and on the offensive. The defensive is the death of every armed rising. It is lost before it measures itself against its enemies. Surprise your antagonists while their forces are scattering, prepare new successes, however small, but daily. Keep up the moral ascendancy which the first successful rising has given to you. Rally those vacillating elements to your side which always follow the strongest impulse, and which always look out for the safer side. Force your enemies to a retreat before they can collect their strength against you. In the words of Danton, the greatest master of revolutionary policy yet known, de l'audace, encore de l'audace. What, then, was the National Assembly of Frankfurt to do if it would escape the certain ruin which it was threatened with? First of all, to see clearly through the situation, and to convince itself that there was now no other choice than either to submit to the governments unconditionally, or take up the cause of the armed insurrection without reserve or hesitation. Secondly, to publicly recognize all the insurrections that had already broken out, and to call the people to take up arms everywhere in defense of the national representation, outlawing all princes, ministers, and others who should dare to oppose the sovereign people represented by its mandatories. Thirdly, to at once depose the German imperial lieutenant, to create a strong, active, unscrupulous executive, to call insurgent troops to Frankfurt for its immediate protection, thus offering at the same time a legal pretext for the spread of the insurrection, to organize into a compact body all the forces at its disposal, and in short, to profit quickly and unhesitatingly by every available means for strengthening its position and impairing that of its opponents. Of all this, the virtuous Democrats in the Frankfurt Assembly did just the contrary. Not content with letting things take the course they liked, these worthies went so far as to suppress by their opposition all insurrectionary movements which were preparing. Thus, for instance, their Herr Karl vogt at Nuremberg, they allowed the insurrections of Saxony, of Rhenish Prussia, of Westphalia to be suppressed without any other help than a posthumous, sentimental protest against the unfeeling violence of the Prussian government. They kept up an underhand diplomatic intercourse with the South German insurrections, but never gave them the support of their open acknowledgment. They knew that the lieutenant of the empire sided with the governments, and yet they called upon him, who never stirred, to oppose the intrigues of these governments. The ministers of the empire, old conservatives, ridiculed this impotent assembly in every sitting, and they suffered it. and when William Wolfe, a Silesian deputy, and one of the editors of the New Rhenish Gazette, called upon them to outlaw the lieutenant of the Empire, who was, he justly said, nothing but the first and greatest traitor to the Empire, he was hooted down by the unanimous and virtuous indignation of these democratic revolutionists. In short, they went on talking, protesting, proclaiming, pronouncing, but never had the courage or the sense to act. While the hostile troops of the governments drew nearer and nearer, and their own executive, the lieutenant of the Empire, was busily plotting with the German princes their speedy destruction. Thus even the last vestige of consideration was lost to this contemptible assembly. The insurgents who had risen to defend it ceased to care any more for it, and when at last it came to a shameful end, as we shall see, it died without anybody taking any notice of its unhonored exit. London, August, 1852.